Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're ready to begin Matthew chapter 19. And in chapter 19 we see that Jesus is now beginning to move toward Jerusalem. He and his disciples are on the way to Jerusalem. They're going to be there in time for the Passover. And of course we know that what he's moving toward is the cross. The cross. As this journey begins, let's read what happens. And when Jesus had finished saying these things, those are all the teachings of chapter 18, he left Galilee and he went into the region of Judea, the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him and he healed them there. You notice Jesus is leaving he's leaving Galilee, entering Judea, on the way to Jerusalem. Large crowds are gathering around him. They anticipate he's on the way to Passover. They're following him. They're with him. He heals the sick. His ministry continues, a demonstration of the power of the kingdom. But also what is continuing on this journey is the opposition of the Pharisees to Jesus. Their opposition has been growing. We've seen that time and time again. And now they're ready to ask Jesus a question to involve him in a contemporary controversy that they hope will cause the favor of the crowds to depart from Jesus. So they ask him a question. Verse 3. Now some Pharisees came to Jesus in order to test him. They said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" They're asking about divorce. Is it lawful to divorce your wife? They ask. But notice that the crux of the question is the end, for any and every reason. You see, these Pharisees assumed that divorce was acceptable because that's in the Old Testament. But what they want to know is, what are the grounds for divorce? Is it possible, reasonable, legitimate to divorce for any and every reason? Now, what they're referring to is a passage from the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, where Moses gave some instructions about divorce. Let me just read a couple of verses from Deuteronomy 24, the first couple of verses. Now suppose a man enters into a marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. So he writes her a certificate of divorce, he puts it in her hand, and he sends her out of his house. Now then the passage will continue about what if she remarries. But the focus of the Pharisees' question was just on that first part. A divorce, Moses said, was acceptable with a written certificate of divorce and an appropriate sending of her away. So that was the procedure for divorce in the Old Testament. The Pharisees knew that, they assumed it. What they're asking about is that reason for divorce. Notice in Deuteronomy 24, it says, if the husband finds something objectionable about her. That is the question of the Pharisees. Is it possible or lawful to divorce your wife for any and every reason? The debate in New Testament times was around that, if he finds something objectionable, the grounds for divorce. That's the argument they're trying to involve Jesus in. You see, in the New Testament times, there were two rabbinic schools. One was the school of Hillel, and one was the school of Shammai. These were two famous rabbis of an earlier day. And they both took different interpretations of what Moses meant when he said the reason for divorce. Now, Hillel was the easiest school. It basically said the ground for divorce is simply if you find anything you don't like. So Hillel taught that when a husband found something objectionable, that simply meant if there's any reason you no longer want your wife, you have the right to divorce her. He even said, an example, if she burns your toast in the morning, it's okay to divorce her. Now, you can see that Hillel's view was the more popular view among the day, because that said any grounds for divorce were acceptable. Now, the view of the Shammai school was a little more conservative and a little more strict. Shammai taught the objectionable part means that if there is some type of immorality. So if there's immorality committed, adultery, for instance, that is the grounds for divorce, but other reasons are not acceptable. So those were the debates in Jesus' day. Do you go with the school of Hillel, which any reason for divorce is okay, or do you go with the school of Shammai, which the only rationale for divorce is immorality or adultery. That's why they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, Jesus is going to respond to them, but he's going to answer them in a way they do not expect. You see, they're referencing Deuteronomy chapter 24, when Moses allowed for divorce and the grounds he gave. Jesus says, I want to reference something even more fundamental. I want to take you back to creation. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, the Creator, God, made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother. He will be united to his wife. The two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. In other words, Jesus says the primary reference is not back to Moses in Deuteronomy 24, but the primary reference is back to the story of creation. God intended for man and woman to become one in marriage. And therefore, the act of separating them would be almost unthinkable. So if we go back to creation, God's intent was to say, marriage is for life. For man and woman become one in their marriage, and they are not to be divided again. The creation story says that marriage is for life. Well, why then, the Pharisees say, did Moses allow for divorce? And so Jesus says it's because of sin. Sin has broken the original intent of God, and sometimes divorce happens, not by God's plan, but by accidents and the result of a fallen world. But we'll talk about that more tomorrow. We want to continue this discussion. So in our next session, we'll talk more about why Moses allowed for divorce. But we'll begin by saying that Jesus grounds the reason for marriage in the creation story. And God's intent was that marriage be for life. Marriage is between one man and one woman, and it's meant to be for life. But sin has intervened, so sometimes divorce happens. And we'll talk about that more tomorrow, why Moses allowed for it and what he meant in his allowing for it. Well, you have a great day today, and I'll see you next time as we continue this discussion in our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew.